First, I would like to say thanks to Nick for the invitation to come and chat to all of you about two of my major interests in the Middle Ages. Onomastics, the study of names and naming practices, and specifically those of people and places. I'm also interested in things like naming of animals, naming of ships, naming of other things, but that won't feature into this talk so much. And philosophy, usually specifically an interest in logic, but while I will be talking about logicians here, I won't say very much about logic per se. So my interest in names is a long-standing one, dating back to when I was about 10, and I discovered a list of the 100 most popular boys and girls names in the US in the front matter of my parents' World Book Dictionary. So this was from like the early 80s, and so by the time that I was reading them, it was already about 10 years out of date. But it was the first time that I'd ever been exposed to this idea that names are objects that you can say things about, like popularity and meaning and stuff like that. And after after joining the SCA, so the Society for Creative Anachronism, my interest in names got channeled into historical onomastics, so specifically pre-1600 Europe and cultures that had contacts with it, and with an emphasis on personal names. Place names are also really interesting, but again, they're going to be less of what I'll be talking about today. For those of you who are not so familiar with medieval naming practices, and that's probably like less than half, because most of you are people that I know through my onomastics research, but let me give you a very brief overview of just some of the history and some of the terminology that is relevant for studying names and naming practices in medieval Europe. So personal naming elements can be classified into kind of two types. You've got given names, sometimes called Christian names, but this is fairly problematic when you're operating outside of Christian contexts. So like people in Muslim communities had given names, but they didn't have Christian names. And the other type, by names. So we're all familiar with given names. We all have one. And usually they're given to us by our parents, but sometimes they're also adopted later in life. And I often like to joke that one of the reasons why everyone is interested when I say that I do research in names and I start nattering on about it is that we all have a name. So it's one thing that kind of brings all of humanity together. And so everybody can be interested in the study of names because, oh yes, I have a name, you have a name, this person has a name. So the process by which modern parents select given names for their children involves many diverse factors. You can have goals of honoring a relative, referencing a fandom, incorporating a religious reference, such as a saint's name or a Marian name. You could have just aesthetics. You pick a name because it sounds pretty or because it looks pretty, or picking a name because of its meaning. And yes, the scare quotes are necessary, and I will come back to this. By names, on the other hand, are probably somewhat less familiar in kind of modern contexts because the role that they played in the Middle Ages has shifted with the role that they play in modern times. By names are basically the medieval precursor to modern day inherited surnames. So if you think about modern surnames such as Smith, Johnson, Black, Thorpe, etc., all of these were originally literal descriptions of the person that used them. So they pick out a specific characteristic of a person and they were used to distinguish that person from other people. So like when you live in a village where 2 or 3 out of every 10 men were named John, you need to be able to distinguish whom you're talking about. These literal bynames kind of over time and through various factors having to do with inheritance of wealth, transmission of landed status, of rank, of a variety of different things, these literal descriptions became our modern day inherited surnames. And now we get our surname from one of our parents. Generally, women in many cultures still change their name upon their surname upon marriage so that it matches their husband's. But this is all kind of growing out of this basis in medieval descriptions. So these literal nicknames can be roughly divided into 4 categories of types. There's the occupational bynames that indicate what your occupation was, so Smith, Webster, Baker, etc. Relational bynames indicate your relationship to somebody else, usually by naming you as your father's child, or by naming you as your father's son. So Johnson, Adamson, Anderson, all of these sorts of things. But in the Middle Ages, you can also find more complex relations. So you will find people being recorded as their father's daughter, or sometimes their mother's daughter or their mother's son. And you can even get some really interesting examples of more complex relationships like nephew and grandnephew and stepchild and foster child. So a lot of these different aspects were very important. And in medieval life, you know, who your family associations were is often a relevant way of identifying who you are. The third type are the locative or local bynames, and they just indicate where you are from. So this can be designating some sort of ethnicity, so the Norman, the Fleming, so person from Flanders. It could be on the basis of a city or a town or a region, or even just kind of local topographic landmarks. So like at the hill, from the thorp, by the stream, in the field, and so on and so forth. And then the fourth category are basically the catch-all. It's the other descriptives. So these are the things that can include references to colors, whether it's color of hair, color of complexion, color of clothing that you wear, physical and mental habits, important personal events that may have happened in your life. So this kind of catch-all category includes things like black, Shakespeare, and one of my favorite German bynames, Springen die Rosen, which means jump in the roses. There's also an English one, which I believe is fall in the well, for somebody who fell in the well. And the more that you look at, you know, medieval town guild rolls or baptismal records or taxation records, the more of these hilarious, wonderful bynames that you can find. So the examples that I'm using here are all English, but what I have to say actually holds for pretty much all medieval European cultures. You can find examples of each of these 4 types: the occupational, the relational, the locatives, the descriptives, in pretty much any culture that used bynames. So one thing I will say, just kind of from the historical background and the historical development, is you've got the period that I start my research is around about 500. So it's after the fall of the Roman Empire, where you've got all of these Germanic tribes covering most of Europe. And at this point, we have very low levels of documentary evidence. So if you're looking at records to find out what kinds of bynames did people have, most of the time the answer was they didn't have any. You've got simple documents that refer to the person who's issuing the charter, who is probably a bishop or a high-ranking priest or a landowner, and the names of the witnesses of the charter. And because these charters or documents often had very local concern, it was enough that, you know, so-and-so just signed his name. You didn't have to say, well, you know, which of the many Hildefrids was it that signed? You're going to know who it is. So you don't start seeing the development of these kind of distinguishing descriptors until somewhat later on. So they start becoming more and more popular, more and more necessary from about like the 9th century. You'll start seeing the patronymic bynames, so indicating who your father is, occupational bynames referring to clerical status quite often, and by about the roughly 11th, 12th century, they become more common than not. Now, these are vast sweeping generalizations that I'm making because, of course, how these patterns developed and shifted and changed is going to depend on location. It's going to depend on the people involved, their social class, their social rank, their wealth, whether you're in an urban situation or a rural situation. So these are all just kind of very, very wide sweeping generalizations about how these types of personal naming practices developed over time. So as I said, my area of research generally goes from about 500 to 1600. And my onomastic research over the last 20 years or so has tended to focus on data collection. What I'm really interested in are what are the actual names that were in use in which languages and cultures at which times. So the given names, the by names, I'm interested in what the names are rather than who the people were that bore them. Though sometimes this is interesting because you can find a lot of interesting information about people on the basis of their names or other descriptives that they're recorded with. So for instance, it's really interesting to look at the names of Jews recorded in Christian context documents, or look at how like in the Iberian Peninsula, where you've got the mixture of the Arabic influences and the Iberian influences and all of this coming together. So it can be interesting to know information about the background of the person that has the name, but for the most part, I'm interested in the actual kind of physical names themselves. Depending on the source of the data that I have, so it might be a baptismal record, it might be a taxation record, it might be a marriage register. I'll often do statistical or frequency analysis. So tax records are really good for this because in general, you can be sure that each person is only mentioned in the record once. And so if you have 10 instances of John, that means you have 10 different people named John. Things like burial registers are very good for this as well because people generally only get buried once. Baptismal registers are less useful because if they include the names of parents, people often end up having more than one kid. And so their names will keep coming up. And in fact, if you look at like small marriage registers from little towns in 16th century England, you're like, oh, it's just John, Henry, Roger, Robert, again and again. Brian, there's a Brian. And then every time that Brian baptizes a child, you're like, oh, good on you, Brian. Another kid. Well done. So the source of your data will influence the type of analysis that you're able to do. But statistical and frequency analysis, particularly of the given names, are very interesting because it helps you to be able to chart trends across time. So something that is just phenomenally outstanding out of medieval European onomastic data is watching the rise in the popularity of the name John. So in like the 9th, up to about the 9th, 10th century, you will find it occasionally, and it's almost always the name of a priest or a clerk or some other, somebody associated with the church. And then over the course of the 11th and 12th century is when we start seeing this shift between kind of the generic Germanic names dying out in popularity and being replaced with what I will call the Christian names, because they're Christian in the sense that they are biblical names, they are names of saints, they are names whose popularity is being propagated because of their connection with Catholicism and the Catholic religion. So John is one of those names, and its popularity just becomes meteoric. So that by the time that you are in the 16th century, you can go pretty much anywhere in Europe. And if you have a source that allows you to do frequency analysis, John is almost certainly going to be the most popular name. And in many cases, it's going to be 2 to 3 times more popular than the next most popular name. It's fascinating. Anyway, this is why I only wrote 2,500 words, because I'm saying a whole lot more that I hadn't actually written down. So around about 5 years ago, this interest that I had in kind of collecting and analyzing names culminated in the birth of one of my pet projects, the Dictionary of Medieval Names from European Sources. So I'm going to try the magic share screen. And let's try sharing this one. Share. So this is the DMNES. You can go to dmnes.org/names, and it is, as it says, a dictionary of medieval names from European sources. So you can say click on the name Duncan. Hello, Duncan. And it will give you information about the gender of the name, the etymological roots, the any kind of important historical figures that were that had that name, kings, queens, saints, biblical characters, things like that. Any other kind of relevant information. So here we can see something about how the name was Latinized, and then a bunch of examples. So these are just happen to all be from Scotland and all from Latin records between the kind of middle 11th century and the early 15th century. But if we go and look at another name, Sara, you can see that we have examples in England, in Latin, Dutch, early modern English, and Walloon, and in France and in Wales. And most of them, with the exception of 12th century France, and a little bit in 12th and 13th century England, most of them are all from the 16th century. So, okay, I'm going to stop share. The dictionary attempts to answer the very broad question of which names were used when and where. Now, it's by no means complete. I've been seriously working on it for about 5 years. This is the sort of project that has like a 100-year time span. It currently has almost 2,500 publicly available entries, and there's another almost 5,000 entries that are still being researched. And that latter number, that 5,000, it gets bigger faster than the former number does. So I create new entries that need to be processed at a faster rate than I finalize entries and make them available. But even so, with roughly 70,000 different citations of individual names across the publicly available entries, the dictionary is the largest and most comprehensive cross-cultural study of medieval European given names out there. There are many studies that focus on a single time period or a single language and culture that go into more depth, but this is the largest cross-cultural and covering the largest span of time that is out there. So that's a bit about names. I want to say something now about my other long-standing medieval interest, namely philosophy, and specifically questions of logic and philosophy of language. So when people ask what is logic, and I suspect that at least some of the people who are here for the onomastic side of things are sitting here asking that question, I like to quote a definition given by Roger Bacon in his Art and Science of Logic, which was written around 1250. And conveniently, Roger Bacon is somebody that we'll be coming back to later on in this talk. So Bacon says that logic, as a science, is the habit of distinguishing what is true from what is false by means of rules or maxims or dignities by which we can comprehend the truth of a locution through our own efforts or with the help of others. And logic is so called from logos, which means discourse, and lexis, which means reason or understanding. As it were, the science either of reason joined to discourse or of discourse joined to reason. So when I give this definition to my introduction to logic undergraduates, I point out kind of this fourfold aspects of logic that Bacon is picking up. It is rule governed, it is a joint venture, it involves discourse, which is aimed at distinguishing truth from falsehood. Now, in the Middle Ages, the study of logic was very closely related to the study of semantics. So this is how words, what words mean, how words get their meaning, how sentences get their meaning from the meaning of the words, and then the important connection between semantics and logic is how this meaning is related to truth. So how do we get from rules about how words mean things in sentences to actually being able to figure out what is true and what is false? And in particular, they're interested in questions of how meaning of words in the context of sentences can change in different grammatical or different syntactical contexts. So this is something that I will give some examples of in in a little bit. But generally, when I'm doing research in logic, apart from anything having to do with onomastics, whether it's medieval logic or modern logic, my focus is on kind of the disputational and argumentative contexts that logic can be found in. So when you've got two different people, they both have different knowledge, they both have different kind of commitments in their discourse with other people. Those commitments might change depending on whether they learn something new or whether facts about the world change. So this has connections with issues related to reasoning about time, reasoning about necessity, reasoning about possibility. These are things that are in general entirely unrelated to anything onomastic. There's nothing to do with names in this. But regularly, kind of throughout these sort of two parallel research careers that I've had, I've asked myself, isn't there a way that I can combine my two interests? That is there anything in the intersection of onomastics and logic and semantic theory in the Middle Ages? So that's where this talk comes out of. It's where are the overlaps in these two areas of interest that I have in medieval theory and medieval history? So given what I've said about the close connection between medieval logic and medieval semantics, theories of meaning, there does seem to be, obviously, one obvious candidate for falling into the intersection, namely the meaning of names, proper personal names. Names are linguistic objects, and so any theory of linguistic meaning should account for proper names. But the issue is not as straightforward as that. So, and this is because when we speak of the meaning of proper names, there are two distinct things that we could be talking about, and I'll take each of them in turn. So first is the issue that proper names aren't like other words, in that they don't straightforwardly have the same sort of semantic content that other words have, or in particular nouns. Let's not worry about prepositions or articles or things like that. Let's just talk about nouns. Proper names don't have the same sort of semantic content that other nouns have. So there isn't any kind of universal form that ties together all people called Sara, in the same way that there is one that ties together all animals called dog. Though, side note, this only works if you are a realist about universal forms, and the realist versus nominalist debate on the meaning of nouns was actually a very active one in the Middle Ages in the 12th and 13th centuries, but that would be the topic for another talk. So contemporary philosophers of language often say that proper names just don't have any semantic content. They don't have meaning in the way that other words have meaning. What they have is referential content. They exist only as a means to refer to things. So Sara doesn't have any meaning beyond its meaning as a mechanism to refer to me. This is contrasted with common nouns like dog, which do have semantic content, and it elicits the meaning of the word. And then also in some contexts, dog also has referential content in picking out like actual dogs. So this kind of referential versus semantic distinction, in the way that modern philosophers put it up, isn't one that was available in the Middle Ages. But it is true that much of kind of medieval semantic theory discusses proper names according to kind of what we can call non-anachronistically their referential properties. And this is in the context of a particularly medieval development in semantic theory called supposition. So briefly speaking, and glossing over variants found in many different authors, because you weren't a proper medieval logician if you didn't have your own idiosyncratic view of what supposition theory was. So glossing over all of that, what a noun can supposit for, and you should think of it as what the word can stand for in a sentence, will depend on the context of the sentence that it's in. So I'll give some examples. As a brief example, take the word human. So the medieval philosophers would say that human has natural supposition when I say something like, human is a species. Because here the word is taken for what it signifies, which is a concept. So human picks out this concept of humanity. This is what it stands for. And it has this natural supposition for that because there's a sense in which the word is kind of naturally connected to the concept that it signifies. But when I say human has 2 syllables, then I'm not talking about the concept anymore. I'm talking about the literal word, human. And this use of the word is called material supposition because you're talking about the matter. So medieval philosophers following Aristotle like to have this distinction between the form of something and the matter of something. So the people have the form of human beings, but their matter is, the raw material that goes into our bodies. So the matter of the word is kind of the physical form of the word. And then a third type of supposition that a word can have is personal supposition. So when I say some human is running, because I'm not talking about the concept of humans, I'm not talking about some species, I'm not talking about the word, I'm talking about I'm referring to individual objects that fall under this concept. So if I say some human is running, I'm talking about some actual person out there. So the word also has personal supposition in the sentence, Socrates is a human. So it's moved from being the subject of the sentence to being the predicate, but it's still picking out an individual person, namely Socrates. Not only that, but Socrates also has personal supposition in this sentence because it picks out a person. In fact, this type of personal supposition is called discrete because it's picking out one distinct and well-identified individual. Now, I could easily spend an hour talking about different 13th century accounts of supposition, and there's distributed supposition and determinate supposition and confused supposition and merely confused supposition, and an entire talk on where proper names fall into each of these different accounts. But I'm not going to, because there is a sense in which when we are talking about the meaning of a name, this isn't what we are talking about at all. We are not talking about philosophers and semanticists and linguists and what they have to say about how names can be used to refer to things in sentences. No. Ordinarily, when someone talks about the meaning of the name, they are talking about the sort of thing that you find in a baby name book. So lovely things like What to Name Your Baby, a guide from Adam to Zoe, or Baby Names from Around the World, which book I actually have 2 copies of. Don't know why I needed that, but there you go. So the sort of thing that if you open up one of these books and you look at the meanings that are given there, so that Hildefrid means battle piece, or that, excuse me, or that Electra means amber hair. And yes, both of these glosses occur in books like these. Or even that heather means gray-green bushy plant, or the idea that Thomas means that somebody is a twin. So these are the sorts of things that people generally think of when we talk about the meaning of a name. But as we noted at the beginning, when we were first talking about names and meanings of them, names don't have semantic content in that sort of sense. And this is actually one of the reasons why, if you look at just a general dictionary, you're not going to find proper names in it, unless they are the sort of proper name that has kind of become a common noun, like the name Guy. Even if you're looking at historical dictionaries, so things that are dedicated to preserving and helping understand the historical, excuse me, the historical development of a language, even these dictionaries tend to omit proper names. And it is precisely because of this sort of lacuna that was part of my motivation in creating the DMNES. So what people mean when they're talking about the meaning of the name is not this sort of semantic meaning, but rather the etymological origins of the name. So I'm going to share my screen again. There we go. This should be it. So here's the entry for Hildefrid. And what you can see is that if you look at the etymological origins of the elements that go into constructing the name, you do have this Old High German element that means battle and this Old High German element that means peace. So you have these two kind of source elements feeding into the name. Let me get back to my notes. But the combination together doesn't mean battle peace. That's nonsense. The combination itself doesn't have any meaning because it's a name, not a word. But that doesn't mean that we can't look for the etymological roots of a name to find out interesting things. Which is why the dictionary's entries include this etymological origin, and also why there are almost 5,000 unfinished entries, because there are a lot of names out there whose etymological origins are almost entirely obscure. So the important kind of take-home message here is that we provide this etymological information because it provides insight into language development, particularly into how vernacular languages developed, particularly in contexts where vernacular data might be obscured by the widespread use of Latin for written documents, because it helps us make connections between different forms of the same name in different languages, which might have very different, drastically different spellings or forms. But with very rare exceptions, medieval parents didn't choose names for their children on the basis of their meaning in the same way that modern parents often do. And you can see this with examples like Hildefrid. Nobody picks that name for its meaning because it doesn't have a sensible meaning. There are some exceptions to this general statement that I made, and these include things like the class of augurative names that can be found in Italian. So these are names where a child was given at birth some name that says something about a particular fortune or desired future that the child was hoped to have, or sometimes a description of the circumstances of its birth. So there are names that mean something like renewed or re-given, often given to children who are born after the death of an elder sibling. So they are kind of augurative in that they are, in a sense, kind of omens of the birth of the child. And another exception that you might argue for is the rise of virtue names among 16th century Protestants. So that's another case where names do appear to be chosen for kind of the meaning that the word has as a common noun. But what all of this means is that if we want to search for the meaning of personal names in kind of the intersection of medieval philosophy and onomastics, we might find ourselves looking for something that doesn't exist. That being said, I want to turn to two examples where the meaning of personal names was actually discussed in philosophical contexts. So I've got one medieval example and one which isn't medieval, but from ancient philosophy, but which I'm going to tell you about anyway, because it's from Aristotle. Aristotle was widely read by medieval philosophers, so they would have been familiar with this example. So I'm going to take this example first. So he actually discusses exactly what we pointed out above, that given names, which are compounds of words that individually have meaning, do not themselves inherit those meanings, either as isolated parts or in combination. So in his text on interpretation, he considers the case of the proper name kalipos, which is a compound of ancient Greek kalos, beautiful or fair, and hippos, horse. He points out, in fact, in kalipos, hippos indicates nothing by itself, as it, even though it does in the phrase kalos, hippos, beautiful horse. So there's a distinction between kalipos, the compound name, and the phrase involving exactly the same two words, kalos, hippos. And he says, evidently, what is indicated by hippos does not contribute directly to the signification of the word kalipos. For when someone does make an assertion about kalipos, she only has a man, namely kalipos, in mind, and nothing related to horses or fairness. So I came across this example 2 or 3 years ago, and I thought that was quite interesting because it is picking up on precisely this idea that you can take names that take nouns that in themselves have meaning. You can put them in together into a phrase where the phrase has meaning, kalos hippos, beautiful horse. But when you form from that compound a personal name, it loses that semantic component. If we talk about, my neighbor Kalipos, I don't say anything about whether he is beautiful or he looks like a horse or acts like a horse. All of that gets lost. So that was just very interesting. But now, and I am coming to the end of what I have to say, so we can hopefully still have plenty of time for discussion, is the second example that I have is due to Roger Bacon, whose definition of logic I quoted earlier. He has a couple of very interesting asides on individual proper names in his treatise on signs. So this is a general treatise on how words, whether mental or spoken or written, get their ability to function as signs. That is to kind of to point to something, to signify something outside of themselves. There's also a lot of discussion about how equivocation arises because you've got this one word that can kind of function as a sign in many different ways, and then you don't know which way is being used in which contexts. So this treatise was written sometime before about 1267, probably in the 1250s or early 1260s. So in the section on words that signify equivocally as both nouns and adjectives, Bacon points out that there is an equivocation that arises when, quote, the name of something universal is transferred to a person. And this can happen, that this is something that can happen, comes from the fact that the same word can have multiple types of supposition. So your word human can refer to a species, it can kind of refer to an individual man, but it could also refer to that man as a way of naming him. So he gives 3 examples of this sort of universal thing being transferred to persons. So single words, compounds of 2 words, and entire phrases. And all of these are examples of words becoming names. So as an example of the first, so this is single words, he says, for the name of something universal is transferred to a person, and this can readily happen because names are at our pleasure. So the Latin here is ad placetum. Philosophers hate this phrase. It's hard to translate, but the idea is that we have choice over how things get named. It's not something that is required by their nature. Because of the likeness and the agreement of a particular, so an individual thing, with a universal, we can easily transfer the name of the universal to a particular, because all who transfer do so in accord with some sort of likeness. And we see that some name is common and it is transferred to a particular of another species. So if that was too much philosophical mumbo jumbo, you can ignore it. The interesting thing is the example he gives. He says, for example, rose is the name of a flower, and it is the name of a woman. And the basis for the transference is the beauty of both, in which they agree. So the second and third examples are the names Bonaventure and Bonhomme. And just so that we can see see these examples, we've got Bonaventure is essentially the Latin phrase bona aventura, good luck, good fortune. So here's a nice name. It became very popular from the 13th century on because of Saint Bonaventure. We've got examples in Belgium and France and Italy. And then the other one, Bonhomme, is just a compound of the Latin words bonus, homo, good man. This is a very interesting name because we have examples of Bonhomme with adjective and then noun, but we also have examples of homo bon, where you've got the noun and then the adjective. There are not many names where you have kind of the same construction but in both directions, and I think this is interesting. Homo bon is also the name of a saint, but he was not a very widespread or commonly known saint. And then the example that he gives for phrase names are the phrase names Deus te levet, God lift you up, and Bene veniatus, good welcome, good arrival, good coming. And he says of these that, so all four of these, that they are in use among the Italians, which is very interesting because this goes back to the single exception that I said before, namely that these augurative names that were used in Italian seem to be examples where the meaning of the name or the meaning of the words was actually part of what fed into the kind of creation of the name as a name. So that's one interesting thing to note about those examples. The other thing is what he has to say about the origin of the name Rose. Because despite what many people think and what many baby name books will say, the etymological origin of the name Rose is not the flower. It's actually, the root of the name is the Old English word, I hate pronouncing Old English, so I'm not going to. I'm going to spell it. H-R-O-S, meaning horse. It's only later that the word became conflated with Latin rosa, rose. And so what is super interesting about this particular passage is that it shows that this conflation had already happened by the middle of the 13th century. So Bacon doesn't even acknowledge the fact that this name might have had independent origins in Anglo-Saxon. And this isn't because, you might say, oh, well, how would he have known? He actually has a lot to say elsewhere in De Signis about the origin of languages and Anglo-Saxon in particular. He also has really interesting things to say about constructed languages, which if this were a talk at a science fiction convention, we would now be talking about conlangs, but I will leave that aside for another time. So this is quite interesting because it's one of these instances where kind of everybody knows that rose means rose. Well, that's not true. Everybody who knows that rose actually means horse and that the two became confused. But this is the clearest and earliest example that I have found of it kind of pinpointing where that confusion arose. It's actually quite an old and historic and venerable confusion to think that the name Rose actually means